Calling for help. New York City's mayor says the ongoing influx of migrants from the southern border needs to be addressed by the federal government. We'll hear from an immigration expert on the recent developments and what the future may hold. Hello and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm John Gray in Albany. As the year comes to an end now, New York continues to see developments, and not all of them are good. New York City continuing to call for federal help and aid as more buses are arriving in New York City from the southern border. The calls coming as the number of migrants arriving in the city continues to increase. According to city officials, some 14 buses arrived in one night last week, totaling roughly 7,000 new migrants in just 2 weeks. The grand total of new asylum seekers in the city, well over 160,000 to date. Eric Adams pointing the blame for this migrant influx in New York at the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott.
This is a national problem that has only been exacerbated by Governor Abbott's cruel, inhumane politics, and that requires additional national solutions.
The city mayor declaring by executive order that any bus that arrives without at least 32 hours notice will face a misdemeanor charge as well as fines and other legal responses. Joining us now to give additional insight into the recent immigration development as well as the year as a whole when it comes to the migrant influx is Sienna Freeman-Tolbert. She's an immigration expert, with a lawyer as well with Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna. Welcome back to the show. We knew when we had you earlier this year we'd have you back probably before the end of the year, and here we are.
Here we are.
As bad as it was months ago when you and I talked, it seems like it's actually worse.
It is worse. It is worse. And what we're seeing is we're not seeing as much federal response. Obviously, the federal government, there's the war in Gaza and other things are happening, so we're not seeing that focus that we need to see on the immigration issue and what's happening at the southern border. We thought there would be discussions because we heard that the Congress was trying to tie, the aid to Ukraine to the southern border and see what could happen. So we thought there would be more discussion, more action happening. But now Congress has gone home for the holidays. We know when they reopen in January, they're going to be dealing with this shutdown. So the immigration issue and what's happening at the southern border, and more specifically, what's happening all over in different cities who are taking in these asylum seekers, is going to continue to happen.
It must also feel like I'm not going to pick on these states, but like Iowa, Montana. There must be states that are not really feeling this, but there are places with the big cities like Chicago, like New York City. I feel like we're getting the brunt of it now more than a lot of the country. It's disproportionately hitting us.
I think that's happening because now it's becoming more politicized. So, you have Governor Abbott sending buses to specific cities that claim that they were sanctuary cities, right? So it's Texas versus Chicago, it's Texas versus New York. What needs to be happening is the federal government needs to step in. So when they receive these asylum seekers and they process them, they determine, the federal government, that this person does not need to be detained, they're not a danger, and they let them go. Then Governor Abbott puts them on a bus and buses them to wherever he feels they should go. What needs to happen is the federal government needs to be having these conversations with different cities and states and mayors and governors all over the country, coordinating this, providing the proper funding, and then sending them to a designated place where they can be safe and file their applications and get their work permits eventually. That's what needs to happen. But what is happening is it's falling in the hands of the governors. It's falling in the hands of the mayors. And they are just sending them where they want to send them. And that's the unfortunate piece. And that's where I feel like they've dropped the ball. Some
would say, just look, the only solution is to turn them around at Texas where they're coming across. Is it that simple or not really? Not that simple?
Well, it's not that simple, but I think there is different solutions that can be had, right? For example, I heard someone propose something called safe zones, which I thought was a good idea. Have areas in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador, where they can go in and a U.S. post and interview. So that way they're not making the trek all the way to the southern border. They can go and interview and see whether or not they would be qualified for asylum in the U.S. before they make that trek over. Because then that helps to kind of decrease the numbers, because they know there's not a chance that you would get into the country legally. Now, then if they come into the country without inspection through a legal then they get arrested, right? Because you're not supposed to do that.
Right.
So I think there's actions that need to be taken before they even get to the southern border. And these small things could happen. It's just that we're not getting the attention that we need from the federal government.
As you and I are taping this, I looked before we came on the air. 51 degrees today in New York City, thank goodness. If it was 5, this would be a lot worse, wouldn't it? I mean, it's been a mild winter so far, but January and February could be merciless in terms of temperatures. And if there's a lot of people on the streets, especially in New York City, I mean, we could have a tragedy here.
And also, a lot of the individuals who are coming from Central and South America. They don't have the clothes for the winter. They don't have the coats for the winter. They don't have they're not used to the weather. The long and short of it is. And so they're being bused to places like Chicago, which we know can be frigid with the wind, and other places. And it makes it harder for the mayors and the governors to find a safe place for them to be where they won't have any kind of health conditions due to the weather.
I know Governor Hochul wanted to get things expedited to get people to work if they're here, rather than having them sitting in hotels or wherever, shelter, get them to work if there's jobs available. Is some of that happening now?
Yes.
But is it happening fast enough?
I mean, I remember just a few weeks ago, there was a huge clinic for attorneys to come out and help individuals file their work permit applications to submit, because now it's been over 6 months. You have to have the 6-month waiting period. And so there's been this huge influx of people applying. And I know the federal government has been processing those applications, prioritizing those applications when they receive them. But we still have this 6-month gap. And until we deal with that 6-month gap where people need medical care, housing, you're going to continue to see these issues. It doesn't matter. They still have to come in, be processed, and apply. You
mentioned politics earlier. We're going now into 2024, presidential year. I mean, there's going to be politics involved in everything. Does anything get done with this seriously? Or does Congress get sort of, everybody goes to their neutral corners because nobody wants to cooperate with anybody, get anything done? I mean, it's a big wedge issue, just like abortion, immigration. People fundraise off of this stuff. Yeah, I don't expect anything is going to happen in 2024, because people need to go to their own corners. They need to, say what their position is, and no one's going to be working for solutions. Everyone's going to be trying to be reelected. And so I think that we're going to have another year of the mayors and the governors asking for federal help, and another year of Congress not acting. And plus, we still have Ukraine. We still have now Israel asking for help. Exactly. Why we're seeing this frustration with the people at the southern border, and the frustration with the cities and the mayors. They're like, we need the funding too. So I don't think you're going to get any sort of conversation around this, especially when we're dealing with the shutdown issue and people are just trying to make it from one funding to the next funding. Probably my last question, but people, this show airs all over New York State, not just in the city and not just in Albany. Are we going to see smaller places, the Plattsburghs, the Watertowns, the Rochesters? Are they going to start seeing more of this as well coming to their a town near you? Because they can't all stay in New York City. I mean, it's getting thousands in some cases per day. I expect that there's going to be, hopefully there'll be more coordination between the city and these other areas, because we understand that when you bring people to these areas, they have to have the infrastructure to hold them. There's children there, they need to go to school, so I'm hoping that there's more coordination between the city and Governor Hochul's working on coordinating everyone so they can send them to different places. But I expect that there will be a lot more, especially with what's happening in New York City. And last 20 seconds, if the average person watching this just wants to help in some way, is there a particular fund they should give to? Is there anything you'd recommend in terms of helping? My recommendation is you can do coat drives. People are doing coat drives right now. You can go to places like RISE, that's a refugee resettlement organization here in Albany, New York. And all you have to do is food, your coats, anything you have around the house to keep people warm, that's all they want. Well, I hope when we saw you again, we'd have some good news, but unfortunately, we're a little further down the road, and it's not getting better. I'm sure I'll see you in 2024. I got a feeling you will. Sienna Freeman Tolbert, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, and good to see you again. As the year draws to a close, we are taking a look ahead at the biggest legislative items in the State Assembly. We'll be talking with the Assembly Minority Leader on the biggest items he's looking to focus on next year, as well as the biggest takeaways from the year we just closed out. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm John Gray in Albany. With 2023 coming to a close, we'll be ringing in this new year with some new laws in New York State. Here are some of the most notable laws going into effect in 2024. One law would expand the eligibility for victims and survivors of crime to access victim compensation funds. Another law prohibits employers from requesting or requiring an employee or a potential employee to hand over all their social media names and passwords. Plus, another law would raise the age to get an ATV safety certificate from 10 years up to 14 years of age. Ryan Peterson caught up with the Assembly Minority Leader recently to talk about some of the legislation from the past year and to look ahead at what's to come.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's talk about some of the big items over the past year. There's certainly not a lack of things to discuss here. Let's start with the migrant issue, how the state has handled it, where some of the blame may lie for the problems. We heard from Mayor Eric Adams recently saying that the federal government needs to step up more and help out. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with Mayor Adams on that. I mean, clearly this problem lays at the feet of the Biden administration and their failed border policies. But that being said, we can do a lot more on the state. First of all, why are migrants coming to New York State? Well, a lot of it is because of the sanctuary nature, sanctuary city and sanctuary state that we have. And we should repeal the sanctuary laws, which doesn't allow New York State law enforcement to work with federal authorities to deport illegal aliens, particularly when they commit crimes. Although that wouldn't be a silver bullet in this, is certainly a step in the right directions. The other thing is we need more transparency of how the state is spending money for the migrant crisis. We put, I think, $1.5 billion in the budget, but as of yet, we don't even know how that money is being spent. Now, again, I admit these aren't necessarily, the end-all, be-all of trying to solve this crisis, but they'd be steps in the right direction.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk not too long ago about the money being spent on the company responsible for keeping track of these migrants, keeping track of their housing. Where does that investigation stand, if there is one still at this point?
Well, yeah, I don't think there is much of an investigation on that. That's why we need more transparency going forward. Unfortunately, and again, this is a huge budget crisis. Mm-hmm. They say it could cost up to $11 to $12 billion. And I don't know where the end is in sight. We've had over 100,000 migrants coming into the state, and it doesn't look like that those migrants coming in is slowing down at all.
Another major issue we just recently had a ruling on when it comes to redistricting and those congressional lines here in New York. Major issue before the 2022 election, where the state legislature, the Independent Redistricting Commission couldn't come to an agreement, fell to the legislature under Democratic control. A judge ruled what they came up with was biased. A special master comes in, seemingly truly independent here, with a goal of creating more competitive districts. And the results of the last election seem to prove that. But here we are once again, and a judge has now ruled that those should have only been temporary, and we're back to the drawing board.
Yeah, obviously, I'm very disappointed with the Court of Appeals ruling, allowing this to get back to the drawing board. We're about to start 2024. We're almost halfway through the decade. As you know, redistricting has to be done every 10 years. The idea that we can come back and redraw the maps, it looks like the congressional maps going forward at this late time in the decade, is unbelievable to me. But this is what happens when you have one party rule. The Democrats didn't like the lines that were put forth by the special master, and that actually Republicans won on last election. So they've now changed it. And I'm not optimistic that the Independent Redistricting Commission is going to come up with a plan that's bipartisan, and then it's going to be thrown to the legislature. And I'm guessing we're going to see some lines that will heavily favor Democrats when it comes to Congress. They're not hiding this fact. They've said this all along, so it's not a surprise that this is what's happening. But I think people want to know ultimately. They want an end to this, and they're probably happy with the lines now. If they're not happy with the representation they're getting from the congressman, they ought to be able to vote them out. The fact that we're just trying to change a line to benefit the Democratic Party, it seems outrageous to me.
Does the commission itself need an overhaul, and how those people who sit on it are chosen?
Well, I don't know how you take politics out of politics. Right. I mean, so I have appointments, the Senate Republicans have appointments, and the Dem majorities all have appointments on this. I don't know how you take, who's going to appoint them and not be nonpartisan, I think is a tough question to say. There are things that we can do to make sure that the commission actually comes up with bipartisan lines. One is not have it, if they can't come to an agreement, have it tossed to the legislature where the majorities would make the decision. You could give the Republicans a bigger voice in this, or not, have the Independent Redistricting Commission, whatever lines they come up with, those are the lines that we have to work with instead of, having it go to the legislature, or if it goes to the legislature, require a bigger Republican voice if it's in the legislature. So there are things we could do to make it at least more bipartisan.
Recently, some studies have come out. I want to get to a little bit on education now, and public school enrollment across the country, ever since the pandemic, is down across the board, but specifically here in New York, saw the largest drop in public school enrollment. Now, we know a lot of that had to do with the pandemic and kids staying home and parents choosing to keep their kids home. But why do you think here in New York in particular, they're not coming back?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know how much of that is demographics. I mean, unfortunately, New York State is losing population, and I think our population is also aging. So to some extent, demographics, I think, are playing a role in why public school enrollment is down. But also, I think people want they want success for their children, and they're looking at their options. I know in certain areas, private school and particularly religious education is up, and I think because people are seeing that there's been more success in some of those private schools than there are in public schools. A couple of things that we need to look at. We fund public schools appropriately, but to a tune of really a substantial amount of money in New York State. I think we need to make sure that if we're spending all this money in New York State, we ought to make sure that our schools are performing. And in recent years, we've taken away, and again, and some reasoning that is reasonable, but we're taking away oversight of some of the teaching and going on in schools. And I think we just can't get too far away with that. I know, for instance, the Board of Regents wasn't giving out, finally they did, but wasn't releasing test scores for New York State. If we don't know how our students are performing, how are we supposed to hold people accountable?
And real quick here, crime has been a big component of the Republican agenda of late. We've seen, at least recently here, especially in the capital region, a couple stores in Saratoga have been hit by these shoplifters, this mob shoplifting that we've seen been going on across the country. What are some of the things we need to do to address that and try to stem that problem?
Well, the first thing we do is stop trying to pass additional criminal justice reforms. In the last few years, we've passed things like bail reform, clean slate, and raise the age. And lo and behold, as a result of passing these laws, we see our crime rates going up, and we've seen a lot of people being victimized as a result of these laws. We have to stop those. First, we got to go back and look at that. I'd like to repeal the bail reform and replace it with something more sane that would give judges more discretion when it comes to issuing bail. And then going forward, I was surprised to see my colleagues in the Democratic Party pushing for more criminal justice reforms by, interestingly enough, by giving judges more discretion when it comes to letting people out of jail. Interestingly, in bail reform, they don't want to give judges discretion, but in these new proposals they're making, they want to give judges discretion. We just need to bring common sense back into our criminal justice system. We need to listen to the district attorneys. We need to listen to law enforcement on the policies that work. And what's being passed, unfortunately, now in Albany are policies that just aren't working. They're making New Yorkers less safe, unfortunately. Lots
to chew on, lots to look forward to for 2024. Assembly Minority Leader Will Barkley, thank you for your time. Happy New Year. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Ryan. A change is coming for many elections here across New York State. When we come back, we'll hear from supporters who say moving elections to even years is going to help local issues get even more attention. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm John Gray in Albany. Elections for most local offices in New York State will soon be on the same ballot as the national races. This week, Governor Hochul signing a bill that will move many county and town elections from odd-numbered years to the even-numbered years. Opponents of the legislation say that the change is going to take local issues out of the spotlight. But supporters of the legislation were arguing that even-numbered year elections get a much bigger voter turnout. Earlier this month, we talked with a state senator who explained why he supports the legislation to get more attention on local issues.
If your concern is local issues aren't getting the attention they deserve, how could they be getting the attention they deserve if only 20% of people are voting in those races? They would get far more attention if you have 70, 80% of eligible voters casting ballots in those local races.
Stick around. We'll be back with a look at the week ahead in just a bit. If you have a comment or story idea, please let us know about it. Email us at news@news10.com or reach out on X, known formerly as Twitter, at WTEN. Finally, in Empire State Weekly, as 2023 ends tomorrow, we are set up for some big things in politics here in New York in 2024. Coming January 9th, in fact, Governor Kathy Hochul will be giving the State of the State address. Next year's address will only be her second as elected governor. That address, an opportunity for the governor to talk about the priorities she plans to tackle in the coming year. Last year, you may recall, she talked about gun violence, crime, mental health, and high inflation. We'll keep an eye on the developments and be sure to bring you any of the latest updates and analysis as they become available. For now, from all of us here at Empire State Weekly, I'm John Gray in Albany. We'll see you right here next week. And don't forget, you can watch Empire State Weekly all over New York State. Here's a full schedule of Empire State Weekly on 10 TV stations across the great state of New York.